On October 29, 1945, 5,000 people swarmed Gimbel's department store in New York City. The crowd was so aggressive that 50 police officers were dispatched just to stop the riot, all for a $180 pen. It was called the Reynolds Rocket, and it promised a miracle. It claimed it could write for 2 years without refilling, and unlike everything else on the market, it didn't smudge. But the technology inside that shiny aluminum tube wasn't American. 2 years earlier, this same invention was a classified military secret used by the Royal Air Force to win the air war against Nazi Germany. And it was all created by a Jewish journalist fleeing for his life, who just wanted to solve a simple, messy problem. This is the story of Laszlo Biro and the accidental chemistry that rewrote history. To understand why people would riot for a pen, we have to look at the mess they were living in. In the 1930s, the history of human communication was essentially a history of fluid management. If you wanted to write a letter, you were tethered to the physics of gravity. The standard tool of the day was the fountain pen. While it was a status symbol, it was also a ticking time bomb in your pocket. The mechanism was a controlled leak. Ink flowed down a split metal nib using capillary action, which is the same force that pulls water up a paper towel. But there was a fatal flaw in the design. The reservoir inside the pen contained both ink and a bubble of air. If the temperature rose, or if you took an elevator up a skyscraper, that air bubble would expand. And since the air had nowhere to go, it forced the ink out. The result was the dreaded burp. Documents were ruined, shirts were stained, and writing required a constant pause to use blotting paper to dry the wet ink. For a left-handed person, it was a nightmare of smeared words and blue hands. For Laszlo Biro, a restless newspaper editor working in Budapest, this wasn't just annoying, it was inefficient. And Laszlo Biro hated inefficiency. He spent his days watching massive printing presses churn out thousands of newspapers a minute. And he noticed something strange about the industrial machines that would change his life. Laszlo Biro wasn't just a newspaper man. He was the definition of a polymath, a medical school dropout, a hypnotist, and even a semi-professional race car driver. His mind refused to stay in one lane. Standing in the print shop, he watched the massive rotogravure cylinders spin. He noticed that the newspaper ink dried the instant it hit the paper. It didn't smudge. It didn't need blotting. So, he had a seemingly obvious idea. Why not just put that ink into a fountain pen? He rushed to his lab, filled a pen with the thick, gooey newspaper ink, and tried to write. It was a disaster. The ink was far too thick to flow through the nib. It clogged immediately. Most people would have given up, but Biro realized he didn't have an ink problem. He had a delivery problem. He needed a mechanism capable of handling sludge. The breakthrough didn't come in a lab, but on a street corner in Budapest. Legend has it, Laszlo was watching a group of children playing marbles after a rainstorm. He watched a single marble roll through a puddle and emerge onto the dry pavement. As it kept rolling, it left a continuous, uniform, wet line in its wake. That was it. He didn't need a nib that leaked ink. He needed a ball that carried it. Laszlo took the idea to his brother, Gheorghe Biro, who happened to be a dentist with a talent for chemistry. Together, they engineered a writing tip that mimicked that marble. They placed a tiny, perfectly ground metal sphere inside a brass socket. This design solved two problems at once. First, the ball acted as a physical cap. When the pen wasn't moving, the ball sat tight against the rim, sealing the ink inside and preventing it from drying out. Second, it acted as a pump. As you dragged the pen across the paper, friction forced the ball to roll. The top of the ball scooped up the thick ink from the reservoir and rolled it down onto the page. But the real genius wasn't just the metal, it was the chemistry. They created a non-Newtonian fluid. If you look at the ink inside a cheap Bic pen today, it looks like a solid paste. Gravity doesn't even move it. That is because the ink is thixotropic. This means it stays solid when at rest, so it won't leak in your pocket. But the moment the ball spins, the shearing force of the friction liquefies the paste instantly, allowing it to flow. As soon as it hits the paper and the friction stops, it turns back into a solid gel. It was brilliant engineering. In 1938, they filed the patent. But just as they were preparing to conquer the world caught fire. By 1938, the political walls of Europe were closing in. Hungary was falling under the influence of Nazi Germany, and new anti-Jewish laws were threatening Laszlo's livelihood and his life. His salvation came from a moment that sounds like it was written for a movie. While vacationing at a seaside resort in Yugoslavia, Laszlo was sitting at a table, jotting down notes with his prototype pen. A stranger approached him, mesmerized by the tool that never needed to be dipped in an inkwell. The man introduced himself as Agustin Pedro Justo. He happened to be the former president of Argentina. He handed Laszlo a card and told him that if he ever wanted to manufacture that pen, Argentina would welcome him with open arms. 2 years later, as the Wehrmacht advanced, Laszlo realized he had no choice. He packed his bags, grabbed his brother, and fled across the Atlantic to Buenos Aires. But freedom wasn't free. To fund the factory in a new country, Laszlo had to make a heartbreaking choice. He bartered away huge chunks of his company shares just to survive the initial startup costs. He sold his future to survive the present. In Argentina, the brothers partnered with a financier named Juan Jorge Mene. They combined their names, Biro and Mene, to create the product's new name, the Birome. To this day, if you ask for a pen in Argentina, you don't ask for a pen, you ask for a Birome. While Laszlo was setting up shop in South America, the rest of the world was at war, and surprisingly, the conflict created the perfect market conditions for his invention. The air war over Europe was being fought at 30,000 feet. In the unpressurized cabins of Lancaster bombers and Spitfires, pilots faced freezing temperatures and drastic changes in atmospheric pressure. This was the fountain pen's kryptonite. As the plane climbed and the outside air pressure dropped, the air bubble trapped inside a fountain pen's reservoir would expand violently. It forced the ink out, blinding navigators and destroying vital logbooks. The British Royal Air Force heard rumours of a stratosphere-proof pen being made in Argentina. They tested the Birome and found that the viscous thixotropic ink didn't expand. It worked at any altitude. The British government immediately ordered 30,000 units for their air crews. They renamed it the Eta pen. This was the validation Laszlo needed. His invention wasn't just a novelty, it was a military necessity. But while the British were using it to fight Nazis, an American businessman was about to use it to fight a patent war, and he was coming for Laszlo's throat. Enter Milton Reynolds. Reynolds was a Chicago businessman with a reputation for playing fast and loose with the rules. While on a business trip to Buenos Aires in 1945, he saw the Birome and smelled money. He tried to buy the American rights, but they were already sold to another company. Reynolds didn't care. He hired a team of lawyers and engineers to find a loophole in Laszlo's patent. They discovered that Laszlo's patent specifically covered the capillary action system, the fancy tube that sucked the ink down. So, Reynolds decided to bypass it entirely. He reverse-engineered a pen that relied on simple gravity to feed the ink. It was crude. It was basically the same failed idea from 1888, but with a shiny metal case. He called it the Reynolds Rocket. On October 29, 1945, he launched it at Gimbels. We are back to the riot from the beginning of this video. Reynolds sold 10,000 pens in a single day at $12.50 a pop. In today's money, he made $1.5 million in revenue before lunch. But there was a problem. Because the pen relied on gravity, it would stop writing if you held it at a slight angle. It skipped. It leaked. It was a disaster. Within months, Thousands of angry customers returned the rocket. The market was flooded with cheap, defective knockoffs. Prices crashed from $12.50 to less than 50 cents. The public dismissed the ballpoint pen as a gimmicky fad that had failed. Milton Reynolds took his millions and ran, leaving the industry in ruins. It seemed like the ballpoint pen was dead. But in France, a man named Marcel Biche saw something the Americans missed. He realized the problem wasn't the idea, it was the precision. A ballpoint pen isn't a toy, it's a machine that requires the tolerances of a Swiss watch. If the ball is even a nanometer out of shape, it scratches. If the socket is too loose, it leaks. In 1950, Biche bought the patent rights from Laszlo Biro for $2 million. He invested everything into high-precision Swiss grinding machines capable of shaping tungsten carbide spheres to perfection. He stripped away the fancy aluminum casing and replaced it with clear, cheap plastic so you could see the ink level. He drilled a tiny hole in the barrel to equalize the air pressure. He called it the Bic Cristal, and instead of selling it for $180, he sold it for 19 cents. It worked the first time, every time. It killed the fountain pen almost overnight. Since 1950, Bic has sold over 100 billion of them. It is the most manufactured pen in history, a design so perfect it is displayed in the Museum of Modern Art. But the story doesn't end with plastic, because once humanity got used to holding a cylinder to create, we couldn't stop. The ballpoint pen didn't just stay a cheap plastic tube. Because the mechanism was so small and robust, it became the perfect hiding spot for technology. During the Cold War, intelligence agencies like the CIA and KGB realized that if everyone carried a pen, no one would suspect a pen. They engineered ballpoints that concealed microphones, cyanide gas guns, and eventually, tiny cameras. The spy pen became a trope of Hollywood, but it was real engineering shrinking technology into Laszlo's cylinder. And as we moved into the digital age, we tried to kill the pen. We invented keyboards, touchscreens, and voice-to-text. But the human brain is stubborn. Evolution spent millions of years optimizing the connection between our hands and our eyes. We crave the tactile sensation of holding a tool to create. That is why, when Apple invented the iPad Pro, they didn't tell you to use your finger. They sold you a $129 plastic cylinder called the Apple Pencil. It has no ink, it has no ball, but it mimics the exact friction and weight balance of Laszlo's invention. We even have 3D pens now that extrude heated plastic, allowing designers to draw physical objects in thin air. The medium changes from oil paste to pixels to plastic, but the form factor remains the same. The cylinder is the extension of the human mind. Laszlo Biro died in Buenos Aires in 1985. He lived long enough to see his invention become the most common tool on Earth, but he died before the digital revolution took over. The ballpoint pen didn't change the world loudly. It changed it so completely that we stopped noticing it. If we could bring him back today and place a Bic Cristal in one hand and an Apple Pencil in the other, what would he say? He likely wouldn't care about the billions of dollars made by Bic or Apple. Remember, this was a man who bartered his own company shares just to buy train tickets to escape the Nazis. He wasn't driven by profit, he was driven by flow. He would look at the modern world and probably say something like this: "I did not invent a pen, I invented the removal of friction." For centuries, a writer had to fight their tool. They had to dip, blot, and pray it didn't leak. The tool got in the way of the thought. My legacy isn't the plastic, it is the speed of your ideas. He would likely predict that no matter how advanced AI becomes, or how fast we can type with our thumbs, the stick will never die. Because when we really need to think, when we need to sign a treaty, sketch a building, or write a love note, we don't type, we reach for a pen. And thanks to a frustrated journalist and a marble in a puddle, the ink will always flow.